Hello, class. Hello, class. Welcome to Com Study 9. This is our first week of class. This week, we're going to be focusing on chapter 1, 3, 4, and 5. And basically, every week, I'm going to be filming a little bit like little mini lectures encompassing the main concepts of this week's readings, just to help you focus on some areas and probably explain things a little bit more in detail than what the book does for you. So this week, like I said, we are going to be reading chapters 1, 3, 4, and 5. And I'm doing a mini lecture kind of on the concepts that stand out from chapters 1, 3, 4, and 5. So the concepts that stick out for these chapters for me are the model of communication, the idea of perception, verbal and nonverbal communication. So I'll go over the main ideas of these chapters. And if you have any questions, do not hesitate to reach out to me. Make sure that you're doing the readings and let us get started. So chapter 1 talks about the definition of communication. While you're doing your reading of chapter 1, you will see that there are many different ways in which scholars have defined communication. The definition that has been mentioned in the textbook is the one that we're going with. But one of the things that I want to focus a little bit on this particular mini lecture is the idea of models of communication. So one of the things that began when the field of communication started is kind of understanding how the communication process worked. A lot of scholars were trying to figure out how do we get message from point A to point B. And initially, the first model of communication that they came up with was the linear model of communication. The linear model of communication said basically person A sends message to person B. And it was just an arrow that was unilateral from person A to person B. However, one of the things that scholars found out was that that model was not describing exactly how the communication process works. I don't know about you, but once you have a conversation with somebody else, it doesn't go neatly as that, right? Like I send message and the other person listens. Obviously, the other person is responding to my message as I am giving them my message. So the model kind of goes back and forth. So the arrow going one way is not the perfect explanation of the model. Then scholars came up with the transactional model of communication, which is the one that we're sticking with for this class and for other communication classes. The transactional model of communication looks more like this, like the image I have on my PowerPoint slides. It looks more like a circle. And the reason why it's called transactional is because both parties involved in that communication are sending messages, are transacting or exchanging information, and together they create a bigger meaning. So the transactional model of communication has more parts rather than just point A, point B, and then an arrow, right? So the model of communication, the first part is the source. The source or the sender is the person that initiates the conversation. So if I were to say, if I were to talk to somebody and say, hey, how are you doing? I'm the sender or the source because I am initiating the conversation. The person who receives or the person who the message is intended for is the receiver. While I am sending information, while the source is sending information to the receiver is giving me some type of feedback, whether it be nonverbal, nodding, smiling, or some type of like verbal cues like, the uh-huhs, yeah, that's giving me some type of feedback. The message is what you're sending from, one person to the next. So if I said, hey, how are you doing? Would you like to go to lunch? That's the message that I'm sending to that person. The person can choose to return the message and say, yes, I'd love to go to lunch, or no, I can't, I'm busy today. So that exchange or the information that I'm sending to the person is the message. The channel is in this model, and the channel is basically the medium through which we send the message. Obviously, there are tons of mediums through which we can send our message nowadays. You have your cell phone in which you can quickly send a text message to someone, and that would be the channel through which you're sending a message. When we're talking to a person face-to-face, the channel that we're using is either the air or sound, because that's how we're sending the message to the other person. The noise refers to anything that gets in the way of a message. So for example, if you are on a call and you're going up a mountain and the signal of your phone starts going off, that will be an example of noise, right? That the signal goes in and out is an example of something that's getting in the way of that message. And a face-to-face environment could be other people talking over you, noise going on outside. That could be also noise. Another thing that we have to take into consideration when it communication is context. Every message is going to be interpreted within a given context. So for example, if I were to start crying in front of someone, depending on the context of your relationship, that's how one person is going to interpret it. If I am crying in front of the barista at Starbucks and I have no idea who they are, maybe the context will be different. The interpretation of that message will be different. But if I were crying with my best friend from a long time, then that context is way different. So as you can see, this is the reason why we use the transactional model rather than the initial linear model, because again, this one is more all-encompassing. It talks about all the different parts that go into play when we're communicating with another person. So this is the main concept that I wanted to cover from chapter 1, just the idea of how communication happens, kind of help us visualize it. Out of chapter 3, the two main concepts that I wanted to focus on are the idea of self-concept and self-esteem. Many of us have probably wondered, if somebody were to ask you, how would you describe yourself in a few words? Some of us might say smart, confident, silly, goofy, really shy, strong temper, right? We can describe ourselves to other people, but have you ever wondered how you actually come to know who you are? Well, that's what the chapter 3 talks about. It talks about all self-concepts and perception. So when we're talking about your self-concept, is basically your knowledge and thoughts about yourself, about your feelings, weaknesses, strengths, and worldview. So for example, if I were to look at my self-concept, I would say that I am a very extroverted person. I am extremely friendly. And one of my weaknesses, I would say, is that, I have like really bad social anxiety when I'm with a one-on-one interaction with another person. That will be one of my weaknesses. And one of my strengths is that I'm very caring. So my self-concept is basically just how well I know myself and how I can describe my weaknesses, strengths, feelings to other people. And we come to know self-concept based on the following things. So one of the things that children learn from a very young age is when they interact with others, they kind of learn how to create their own self-concept. So if you remember when you were a child, your parents will tell you, oh, you're very strong, or you're really smart, or you're really confident, or you're a crybaby. You start internalizing the messages that others send to you, and that's what contributes to basically your self-concept. And that's basically what the looking glass self talks about. The looking glass self theory says that how other people that surround us, whether it be our classmates, family, friends, other people that surround us, act as mirrors. So they kind of reflect what they see in us, and then we internalize that to create that self-concept. So basically every single interaction that you've had with a person, it has been like interacting with a mirror that has given you a reflection of who you are. And then that's how we internalize it and create our self-concept. Also, another way that you can create your self-concept is through comparisons. When you look at another person and you see this person as incredibly smart, you will say, am I equally as smart? Am I more smart? Or I'm less smart, right? You compare yourself to other people. Also, we learn this through culture. Cultures have different values and systems that we learn. And we compare ourselves to those values and those systems, and we decide whether we match them, whether we surpass them, or whether we're below them. Also, we do our own self-evaluations. Every time that we are kind of looking at ourselves, we know what our weaknesses are, what our strengths are. So we tend to sit down with our behaviors, our knowledge, and what we know about ourselves. And that's how we kind of get to create our self-concept. So our self-concept is based on all these ideas, like the looking glass self, social comparisons, cultural, and self-evaluations. The next thing that I wanted to focus on when it comes to chapter 3 is this idea of self-esteem. So self-concept is knowing your strengths, weaknesses, so knowing information about yourself. The self-esteem is taking that information and thinking of how much you value yourself, like how you feel about yourself? Do you think that all the characteristics that make you a great person, lovable person, are you proud of it? Or are all these characteristics combined something that you're not proud of or you feel sad about? So again, it's kind of all related to this idea of the self-concept. How do you feel about yourself, about your values and your qualities? Do you feel proud of who you are, or are you not proud? So again, these are the two concepts that I wanted to focus on when it came to chapter 3. Obviously, chapter 3 goes into a lot of detail about self-concept, self-esteem. It goes into the idea of perception, and it talks about the perception process. So make sure that you are doing the reading for chapter 3. When it comes to chapter 4 talks about verbal language. And when we're talking about verbal language is not only what's spoken, but it's also what's written. So when we talk about verbal language, we're talking about oral language, so spoken language and written language. So anything that's either oral or written is a verbal language. And basically, one of the books that I really have loved the teaching from defines verbal language as an agreed upon and rule governed system of symbols used to share meaning. So let's break this definition down. So the idea is the agreed upon part of the model says that whenever somebody creates a language, that means that there are a group of people who created the language that agrees on those meanings for those particular words. So for example, if you look at the dictionary, we're constantly adding words to the dictionary. The word selfie, the word meme has been entered into the dictionary. And people have agreed upon a definition of meme and selfie when they added it onto the dictionary. So that's the agreed upon fact. Also, language has rules. If you remember going back to elementary school, they taught you like rules of language, like basically like the subject, verb, object. So you start with a subject, Billy, and then you are followed with a verb. Billy kicked the ball, subject being Billy, verb being kicked, and the object being the ball, right? There are rules that kind of govern how we use language. And all these rules, all these symbols are basically used to share meaning. There was a time, where we didn't have verbal language and we couldn't really express ourselves. This was at the time when we consider the area of, cave people, right? At that time, there wasn't like much language, verbal language to kind of like describe what was going around. And until we came up with these agreed upon rule governed system of symbols, that's when we started to learn to see society as we know it today. So again, verbal language is basically a system of symbols that we all have agreed upon on their meaning, and that there are certain rules that we have to follow when it comes to it. And verbal language obviously has several different functions. There are different areas within verbal language that deal with the sounds, that deal with meaning, that deal with structure. And I highly encourage you to like focus on that chapter of the textbook because it will help you make a lot more sense of what verbal language is. The last thing that I wanted to talk about was nonverbal communication. One of the things that I want you to keep in mind is that verbal communication and nonverbal communication go together. They go together because when we think of it kind of like looking at a puzzle. When you look at a puzzle, all these pieces come together to help you see the entire image that you're putting together. That's how verbal and nonverbal communication works. We can only get a certain percentage of meaning from verbal communication, but when we put together the nonverbal communication, it kind of gives us like the full picture. So when verbal communication, we're talking about any other type of communication that's not words. So eye contact, touch, whatever you're wearing, posture, how fast, how slow you speak, any vocal fillers that you might have, all of that is a type of nonverbal communication. So again, anything that's beside words is nonverbal communication. So touch, posture, physical appearance, eye contact, the way that you use space, all of that is nonverbal communication. And nonverbal communication has several principles or certain kind of goals that it means. One is that it helps you kind of convey interpersonal and emotional messages. So let me ask you a question. How do you know that two people are in a relationship? obviously some people would say, well, you know, they have to tell us that they're in a relationship. But if you look at their nonverbal characteristics as they're walking down the street, they're usually very touchy-feely, they're holding hands. And that's kind of like a nonverbal way of letting us know their interpersonal and emotional connection. Next, nonverbal communication, it is more involuntary. With verbal communication, you can control what you say. You usually think before you say certain things. It's more control. When it comes to nonverbal communication, it's involuntary. Sometimes you're not meaning to send a message, but you still send it regardless because of your nonverbals. So for example, let's say that it's the first day of school, you're walking on campus and you see somebody leaning against the wall, looking down, having their headphones in and their hoodie on. Obviously, they're not telling you anything, but you are getting a message from them, kind of letting you know, stay away from me. So nonverbal communication is more involuntary. Also, nonverbal communication is more ambiguous. It's really hard to interpret nonverbal communication at times because, you know, it is not tangible. It's not something that is direct. So it is really difficult to interpret that. And also, fun fact, nonverbal communication has been considered more credible than verbal communication because of that aspect that it's involuntary, right? So if you have ever looked at someone and tried to figure out whether they're lying or telling the truth, usually the nonverbal communication gives away whether they are lying or telling the truth. So when we're looking at whether somebody's telling the truth, we look at, you know, what, like, you know, things that they're doing with their hands, their gestures, their movement, their eye contact, right? Usually when somebody avoids eye contact, it's indicative of a lie. So nonverbal communication and verbal communication go together. And like I say, think of it this way, they are like two puzzle pieces that when they come together, they create the bigger picture of the message. So hopefully this has given you an idea of the encompassing message of chapters 1, 3, 4, and 5. Make sure that you're doing your readings so that you get a better understanding of each one of these concepts. I just wanted to highlight the main concepts that I thought were really important for us to talk about. Make sure that you're doing the reading, that you're taking your quizzes, and that you're completing your work. If you have any questions, do not hesitate to reach out to me. If you want more clarification, I am here for you. But again, welcome to week 1 of our class, and I hope that this mini lecture helped you understand these concepts. I will see you all next week.